don't obey in advance and resist are two things that probably everyone in this room gets and we want to work on. One of the questions, one of the challenges we have is how to do that. We're pretty proud of our members of Congress here in Connecticut. We're trying to work in ways that we can. How important are things like marches, like protests, which is something that we can go and do in other states and nationally? Can this help, or is this just fun?
Okay. So first of all, don't underrate just fun, right? It's going to take, and this is a serious point, it's going to take a long time, right? I mean, even if Mr. Trump resigned while I was giving my lecture, and I admit, like, I keep looking for the mystical incantatory phrase, which will make that happen, we would not be out of this by a long shot. And, you know, every lesson which is in the book is meant to be good civic practice, regardless of whether we're facing, as I believe we are, an authoritarian regime change or not. So the things that you do now, whether they're protesting or whether they're just subscribing to newspapers, these things are all meant to be ways of making ourselves better citizens for whatever happens to come down the line. Now, when I say don't underestimate the fun, I'm actually trying to make a serious point. So everyone I know, whether it's people, you know, in their 70s who are, you know, revolutionaries from 1968 in Eastern Europe, or whether it's people in their 20s or 30s whose revolutionary experience was Serbia, well, they're in their 40s now, or Ukraine, they all had been doing this for a long time. And there are moments, you know, and no one can be dead serious about it the whole time. I mean, the situation is dead serious. But we as individual human beings, we can't afford to exhaust ourselves by treating ourselves inhumanly. So part of the reasons one marches is because it is fun. It is fun. And it's fun in a very special sense because it means that you're not, it takes you out of your house, out of your community, and you get to be with people, right? Like I was in the March for Truth in New York. I was one of the speakers of the March for Truth in New York the other weekend. And it was just so great to be with a lot of strangers who had fantastic signs, right? It was great to feel that energy, right? Not because like we all have to agree about everything, but there's something particularly just wonderful about that feeling. And that's part of why one does it. Because that thing that the crowd is doing for you, you're also doing for the crowd by being part of the crowd. And if nobody does it, then nobody does it. But marching is also really important, and you already know this, because when you march, you tend to meet people and make connections you wouldn't have made otherwise. And those can then lead to other things. And then in general, in politics, marching is important because marching buys time. Even if you're not sure what the next thing is that comes after the Women's March or the Climate March or the March for Truth or whatever the next marches are going to be, you keep scheduling the marches and you keep doing them because that is a thing which buys time for the next thing, right? And also marching, since we're talking about marching also reminds other people that you're here, right? The people who don't agree with you. It reminds them that you're human, that you're here, that you care about these things. It doesn't make them agree with you, but it makes it just that tiny bit harder for them to imagine you as those outsiders, those aliens that you're portrayed on the internet or on television. So yeah, do it. It matters. Okay, I'm being really long-winded. We should talk for like 15 or 20 minutes. I'll try to do better. I'll try to just make one point.
Hello, thank you very much for being here. My question has to do with people who do not think like us in this room. I would like to know how we can reach people who think Trump is doing a terrific job and do not have any of the same issues that we are all experiencing and probably are not losing sleep at night. How those people in Ohio, if you talk about, how do we reach them? How do we change opinions?
Okay, so I'm going to break my promise that I just made. So the first thing is you're already doing a lot if you're reaching people who think similarly. The main danger from November, let's say, to the middle, November of last year to the middle of 17, was that the people who were disoriented would be disoriented and lonely, or would be disoriented and write emails, as opposed to being disoriented and getting together and doing something. So that is already a lot. And that has had real political significance in the United States thus far. Had that happened, had the tens of millions of people who were shocked just stayed at home and just done nothing, I think court verdicts would have been different. I think more legislation would have passed. I think we'd be in a very much darker place right now. So I just want to say, it's even if you reach nobody, right, you're still doing a lot by doing what you do. The second thing I want to say about this is that there are lessons about this in the book, like the small talk lesson, which is interestingly one of the things that it keeps coming back at me. It's a one-page one about making small talk, where I'm basically after you make small talk and eye contact to affirm people so they don't feel like they're excluded, because that's really significant in histories of Nazi Germany. The Jew writes about the moment where their neighbor starts to cross the street. Right, so it's really significant to keep everyone in view, to keep them like corporeally involved, so that they don't feel left out, and that changes the political atmosphere. And it was also about denunciation. So you should make eye contact in small talk, because we could be going to a dark place, and you need to figure out who is who before that happens. But small talk means something else as well. It means that you help people who maybe disagree with you to see that you're a human, but also you can plant some seeds. So that with the small talk, you never convince anybody. Like this is like, so I knocked on a lot of doors. I knocked on a lot of doors, and I don't think I convinced, and I'm not bad, right? Like I'm not bad at talking to people, but, and I was from where I was going. I mean, it wasn't like I wasn't just parachuting in. I mean, I was doing like a Philip Roth type thing to myself, which I never should have done, which was canvassing in the neighborhood where I grew up. Right? Like that, yeah, that was biographically very dark in lots of ways. But I wasn't a total stranger, but my point is that I don't think in September and October I made any difference at all. But some of the things that I said in September and October are now coming back to me in emails 6 months later, because I planted some kind of a seed. Right? I didn't make anybody love Hillary, but I did get some people to think who wouldn't otherwise have thought about maybe the Russia thing is not just made up. Right? Because that's what I was actually obsessing about back then, as you can already tell. And so when you make the small talk, you can plant seeds. And the thing is, there's zero instant gratification, right? Like maybe you're in a really good relationship where like you say something and your partner immediately agrees. But that almost never happens, right? Like that in general, like if you're in a relationship, even like the person you love the most, you say something, it's not like they immediately go out and cut the grass or whatever, right? They take into consideration and then maybe a couple weeks later or whatever. So with strangers, you can't expect instant gratification. But if you just keep talking, it does plant seeds and it does eventually change the atmosphere. And then, I mean, just, going places, showing up, matters. And I think the other, this is, now I'll get real tactical on you. You don't actually have to convince that many people. Like if the Trump support goes down by 5%, that would be tremendous, right? If it goes down even 1 or 2%, that's going to make a huge difference. And the number of people, according to the polling, who are strongly supportive of Mr. Trump has already gone down significantly, which suggests that the next step, going from support to uncertain, right? It's the 5 to 4. People have gone down from 5 to 4. And so that's still, like when people say support for Trump hasn't changed, the overall number of support hasn't much, but the degree of support within that has actually changed, which suggests that outside factors do make a difference, and at some point there can become some kind of breaking point. So we have to keep doing what we're doing. It does change the atmosphere. It really does. And so in Ohio, to answer your question, I did get, and in my life in general, I spend a lot of time talking to Republicans, actually, some of whom don't want me to say that I've been talking to them, right, which I find interesting, including Republicans who are thinking about how they're going to design their campaigns for 2018, and they say like, can I like borrow some of your 20 lessons because they sound kind of patriotic and nice to me? And I say, sure, by all means, just mention the book. So in Ohio, Ohio, didn't go the way I expected it to go. I wanted more fiction than I got because I went to cities, and in cities I basically got the same. You guys, right? I basically had this group in Toledo and in Cleveland and in Dayton and Cincinnati and Columbus. Basically, I had this group, the same people. But I did have some Republicans, and they weren't all my blood relations. Admittedly, some of them were. But I did have Republicans come to the talks, and I did have meaningful interactions, and I do with them, and I do over email, and I think it slowly does make a difference. It only has to make a little difference, right? Just a little bit of difference. And
is that you said to respect the laws. And the problem is the laws have been changed, like Citizens United, which allowed companies to give no controls on the amount of money they can give, like the Patriotism Act, which allows people who've been accused of terrorists to be put in jail without any recourse. And this is what happened in Hitler. He changed the laws, and the judges went along with him. So this to me is something that there's a difference between the law and justice. And people are always talking about laws, and I hear very little talk about justice.
Yeah, no,
This is a great point, and you'll notice that what I tend to talk about what I said in the lecture was the rule of law, which is something more profound, more basic, and I think more indispensable than what this or that law might be. I agree with you that we have laws on the books which move us away from being a democratic country. We have Supreme Court rulings like precisely Citizens United, which move us away from being a democratic country. The legality of gerrymandering moves us away from being one person, one vote. If you're in Ohio and you're a Democrat, your vote counts for half as much as a Republican. If you're in Wyoming, your vote counts for, 30 times as much as a Californian president. That's not one person, one vote. And it's been a century since the consensus emerged around the world among legal scholars that democracy means one person, one vote. We're not there. If, as you say, rich people from out of state can throw millions of dollars and throw an election in the state, that's not democracy. That's some version of that's kleptocracy, right? That's oligarchy. So I'm not up here to say that the United States of America is a perfect democracy. Democracy is a very good system, and that if we had better democratic mechanisms, we'd get better outcomes. It wouldn't be where we are today. And I agree that some of those laws have to be changed. But you'll also notice, I don't know if you've read the book or not, but as you get through the book, towards the end, towards the darker moments, there's not so much about how you have to obey the law there, because sometimes you have to break it. Right? That's what you wanted me to tell you, right? All right, there you are.
Thank you for the question. If I may, I did read the book and enjoyed it. However, yesterday, James Comey took an oath, and as he spoke under oath, he said that a certain person who lives in 1600 in Washington lied. Today, that person said that he is willing to take an oath that would say that Comey lied. How is the United States supposed to interpret these totally contradictory statements?
I gotta say, I feel like that's a pretty easy one. When historians look at sources, we don't say, I read it, therefore it's true, or someone said it, therefore it's true. We read each source in the light of various contexts. What it was written for, in what circumstances, by whom, at what moment in that person's life. If we compare Mr. Comey and Mr. Trump, now admittedly I don't have the sobriety that 60 years of time would give me, but if one applies those methods, in a kind of rough and tumble way with Mr. Comey and Mr. Trump, Mr. Comey's problem is that he is so much of a rule follower that he gets himself tied up in knots, right, all of the time, in ways that make him look like sometimes he's exercising bad faith. But it's difficult to find an occasion where Mr. Comey just comes right out and says something that's not true. With Mr. Trump, there's an abundant context in the other direction, right? It's not just that the people who are paid to evaluate whether claims made in public are true or not have found that Mr. Trump is the biggest liar in the history of record keeping in the United States. It's also that his very political style, as I was trying to allude to earlier, and as you know from the book, I say this there too, his very political style depends upon undermining the very notion of truth itself, right? So when Mr. Trump says, I will swear I think that has no content, because there just is not anything in Mr. Trump which would suggest that he cares at all whether he's breaking the law. Now, personally, I mean, I didn't know the thing that you said. Personally, I mean, like Mr. Comey said, Lordy, I hope there are tapes. You know, Lordy, I hope he swears, right? Because that becomes something he can then be prosecuted for, right? He can be prosecuted for perjury, which is a way that people, that's the way scandals sometimes begin to unfold, right? So let him go, let him take an oath about that and a whole bunch of other stuff, because that will simplify matters. And I don't mean this as a joke. I don't think he's actually capable of telling the truth in a sustained way. So if he could be gotten under oath for 6 or 8 hours in a normal testimonial type setting, I think that would be really good for the country.
It seems to me that tyranny thrives on economic insecurity, when people feel they don't have a job, or their job isn't good enough, or they don't have enough savings, or they're worried about losing their house, or they're worried about being not rich enough. And it seems to me that's when people get angry, and they turn from being blue-collar Democrats into blue-collar Trumpites. What do you think?
So I'm gonna broaden it out a little bit. I think that inequality is one of the root problems in this country. I think that the bet that we made after 1989 that the so-called free market would generate, you know, all things considered, you know, with like this, that, the other thing, that this would generate positive political outcomes was a bad bet. A bad bet that ignored what we had learned in the 1930s precisely about the way that unrestrained markets lead to unpredictable crises, lead to predictable inequality, and when a crisis overlaps with inequality or exacerbates it, as in the German elections of 1932, you can get outcomes which, you know, have fantastically awful historical consequences. We knew that once. And part of where we are now, and one of the reasons I wrote the book the way that I did, is that we have so much distance from these lessons that we can forget them. And of course, there are people who are highly motivated to forget them as well. So I would broaden it out, and I would say that the fact of inequality, or the acceptance, the growing acceptance that nothing can be done about inequality is quite pernicious. So if it's not, it is as you say, I agree with that, but it's also, if you have been told over and over that government can't help you, even though it can, right? Even though it manifestly can, then you can think, well, the only thing that's going to make me feel better, because it starts to become about feelings, because your life can't be changed. The only thing that's going to make me feel better is if this guy, you know, goes into Washington and just breaks stuff. And that's a sentiment which one did encounter a great deal in the fall of 2016. And then there's another way that inequality matters. It's that inequality then, and this is like Aristotle, the founders, everyone, inequality favors demagogues. Because a demagogue, Mr. Trump, for example, can say, look, you know, I'm not going to imitate him, because there are really good Trump imitations out there in the world, and mine's not one of them. But a demagogue can say, look, you know and I know that it's all fixed. You know and I know that democracy's a joke. You know and I know that money is all that counts. Appealing to the cynicism that arises when inequality is real. And then the next move is to say, in this world of inequality, you should vote for me, because I'm your kleptocrat, right? I'm your oligarch. Yeah, I'm awful. You know, they're all awful. Hillary Clinton's she's just a hypocrite because she doesn't admit she's awful. She's got oligarchs behind her, right? But I'm your oligarch. There are no oligarchs behind me. I'm yours. And that's a move that you can only make in a situation of radical inequality. And he made that. And it all hangs together, because when those voters looked at him, they looked at him as a substitute for the American dream. I mean, they think, as you said, that they're not going to have social advancement. It's going to be worse for their kids than it is for them. And they're right, right? They're right in many cases. They're right, unless government does something. Now, then they look at Mr. Trump, and he's like, he's the loser who's the winner. right? I mean, he's the man who doesn't really work but somehow seems to be rich. He's the golden boy, right? They look at him and they think that's the shortcut, like that can teleport to the American dream. Somehow this man is going to do it for me. And that kind of appeal, which had that idea of the loser who's a winner, the winner who's a loser, right? That mysterious person who can somehow magically make it all better, that only works precisely in these conditions. So, I mean, I think it's like, it's the notion that government can help and that we can't have this rampaging inequality, that inequality is not just a matter of, you know, us being tolerant of a very small percentage of the country controlling more than half of the resources. It's not just that we don't like that, it's that that has political consequences for everyone,
Could you address the issue of the corruption of democracy through the internet, as reported by people like Carol Walter and exercised by Cambridge Analytica and places like that?
So this is something was very much on my mind when I wrote the book, partly because it's one of the several cases where what happened to us had already happened in other countries, and where we turned out to be uniquely vulnerable to this sort of thing because we hadn't been paying attention to the way the world was going. When I look back at 2016 and the way that we covered this story, it was as though these things were happening for the first time, and it just made me crazy. I mean, it made me crazy when, you know, we should know that the Russians broke into a French television channel and had a fake ISIS advertisement, basically. We should know that the Russians organized in German media a fake Muslim mass rape, right? All for the same kinds of purposes. We should know that the Russians went after Syrian hospital workers. I mean, went after in cyber, right? Syrian hospital workers who were trying to transmit the evidence of what was happening in the bombing campaigns. These are things that we should have already known. That was the context of what happened to us. And we didn't have the context because instead we had the exceptionalism. And because we had the exceptionalism, we had the puzzlement. And because we had the puzzlement, we had the delay. And because we had the delay, we have the President of the United States as Donald Trump, right? So, I mean, I'm not an expert on this. I'll just say a few very general things. The first is quantity of time has changed. People spend ever more time in front of screens. It's now 7 hours a day. I believe that if had it been 6 hours and 45 minutes, Hillary Clinton would have won, right? Had it been 6 hours and 57 minutes, she probably would have won, because it's that time in front of screens which helps, which displaces the real world, right, for an awful lot of people. The second thing which has changed is the sophistication of the transmitted material, which is no longer about a positive, like this is the way that 21st century ideology is different from 20th century. In 20th century, there was a vision, right? There was no small t truth, but there was a big T truth. Now there's no truth, and the way the internet is worked actively is not to get you to believe anything in particular, it's to get you addicted to a whole bunch of random falsehoods and leave you with the sense that I don't really know, but it certainly sounds bad to me. This whole thing kind of sounds bad to me, right? And so people then believe bad things about Hillary Clinton, which are not remotely true. They may not even remember now what they once believed, but they have that sense that, oh, it's bad, it's dirty, it's dangerous, right? And so then to get down to the specifics of what I think you're asking about, it's the way that Cambridge Analytica is supposed to work is that they have algorithms, you probably know all this since you asked the question, but they have algorithms which can predict which voters are going to be vulnerable to which kind of appeal. So if you have that, and you have the harvested political data from we don't know how many American states, but it was a lot, harvested by the Russians in 2016. If you can combine people's voter registrations with the algorithms which predict what they're susceptible to, then you have the tools for a campaign in the last weeks targeting Michigan, Wisconsin, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, which might very well, and I think probably did, make a difference.
Was that Mercer's input?
You're now, like, this is now, like, if I did know this, I would be a different person than I am. My strong intuition is that it was a combination of Russian data harvesting plus algorithms run through Cambridge Analytica. and that it would be stunning if no one in the Trump campaign knew about this, given that Steve Bannon, as I'm sure you know, was one of the vice presidents at Mercer, given that the Mercer family is close to the Trump family, given that Bannon is close to the Mercer family, right? It would be, and in general, like, what is the likelihood that this could have happened without the fact that Trump made that last minute trip to Michigan, did that not strike anybody else as a little bit suspicious, given what we know now? So, I mean, I don't know. You're asking someone who can't possibly know this. I have a feeling that there are people, in our agencies who have some better sense about this, slow as they were to take off. But my strong intuition is that the algorithms would have been private, the data harvesting would have been done by a state, and that the Trump campaign was very likely involved. These are things these are the questions I think that are going to be answered as this scandal stretches out in front of us. But I mean, the thing that we already can basically be pretty sure about is that the election would have had a different outcome if not for this stuff. I mean, one thing I didn't even mention in response to your question were the bots. So it turns out that, Hillary had the so-called ground game. I mean, like, if any of you took part in Hillary's ground game, like, that the myth of the ground game was maybe slightly inflated. But Trump killed her with the bots, 5-1. I mean, they just slaughtered her, slaughtered her with the bots, completely overwhelmed her, and they didn't even know it was coming, right? If it hadn't been just for that one thing, probably the outcome of the election would have been different. So we're in a different world. We've got to figure it out before 2018, or it's going to happen again.
What is your level of confidence or lack of confidence that Robert Mueller and his team can put a dent in all of this?
Okay, I'm gonna answer that by not. I'm not going to answer that, right? But I'm going to give you a reason why I'm not going to answer it. So there's a kind of. I believe in democracy. I believe in civil resistance. I believe in individual action. I believe in liberalism that starts from liberty, from people thinking for themselves about what they should do. And I believe that if we all do little things, that's going to change the atmosphere in a way which will affect the Mueller. And which will affect the other things, which will affect the elections, and that's how we should be thinking about it, rather than asking, is X the magic bullet, right? I mean, Mueller has a suit which says magic on one lapel and bullet on the other lapel, and he stands before us proudly, with the beautiful look and the truly amazingly respectable experience that would make us think this could be the thing. But my basic idea is that there is no one thing. Even if stuff seems to be lining up well in Washington one day, if we just look at it that way, we're going to lose, right? So I'm going to put it in a slightly comedic way. Like, if we count on the spooks to rescue us from the generals, to rescue us from the kleptocrats, to rescue us from the fascists, we're making a mistake, right? Like, I hope so, right? I hope so. I hope so, because I would rather have, I'd rather have the kleptocrats than the fascists, and I'd rather have the generals than the kleptocrats, and so on and so forth down the line. But fundamentally, I would rather be in a country where enough people are acting that it's going to influence, by the chains of influence we do have, it's going to influence those people and make a difference. So, I mean, if it could be I'm glad there's a special counsel, right? Because I think the president's a traitor, and I think the balance of the evidence is in that direction, and I want to find out. But because I believe in facts, I'm only going to be sure when there's an investigation, right? So I think, it's obvious to me there should be a special counsel. That's totally obvious. I'm glad it's Mueller from the little that I know about him. But fundamentally, philosophically, I don't think we can count on anything like that. I think we have to keep pushing.
You said that even if Trump were to resign today or tomorrow, hopefully, we would not be free and clear. What entities or movements or persons are you concerned about?
I mean, this kind of summarizes some of the previous questions. Like the founders, I'm concerned about us, right? I'm concerned about us first of all, what we do. And I don't think Trump is going to resign anytime soon. I think his resigning is a very plausible scenario, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But the thing I worry about then is us, that we then say, oh, it's over, right? That's us, and that's human, and that's what people do after revolutions all the time. And if we do it, that's going to be fatal. I worry about us. I worry about. I think that if it is the Russia scandal that brings, let's assume for a minute the Russia scandal is true, right? It's true in some variant. It's then very unlikely that Mr. Trump is the only person in the administration who's involved, right? In fact, it's basically impossible that he's the only person involved. And that means that let's imagine that there are reasons why Mr. Kushner and Mr. Sessions were talking to the Russians in December. We know what some of those reasons already are: to establish a secret back channel which can't be followed by American law enforcement, okay, which is, let's face it, a little bit suspicious, right? Like, in what world are you where you think it's okay for the Russians to track your communications, to track and record your communications, where you're not afraid, this is interesting to me, you're not afraid of Russian blackmail. The world in which you're not afraid of Russian blackmail is the world in which the Russians already have so much on you that it doesn't matter if they have a little bit more, right? That for me is the striking thing about their seeking a back channel where the Russians can make recordings that American law enforcement can't. It means that the Russians already have so much on them that they're not afraid of giving away more, right? Isn't that amazing? And that's where we are. So, I mean, I don't know that it's automatically President Pence. But if it is President Pence, let's assume that there's some kind of scandal or there's some reason why Mr. Trump resigns. He needs to spend more time with his family, right? That there's some reason why Mr. Trump resigns. We're going to have a lot of the same problems with Mr. Pence, because Mr. Pence has been in this, I'll call it regime, right? And Mr. Pence would probably be a more effective articulator of certain policies which lead us further down the line towards inequality than Mr. Trump was. So I worry about us. I worry about the people who are after Mr. Trump in the line of succession. And I worry about the Democratic Party too. I mean, while we're worrying, right? The Democratic Party has to get its act together. I realize I'm probably talking to like a local Democratic Party, and you have to get your act together, okay. But I worry that the Democratic Party is waiting and seeing. The Democratic Party is not sending people out into the hustings and delivering, those frankly populist speeches about kleptocracy and about Russia, which they should be delivering now. I worry that those politicians in the 30s, 40s, and 50s are not out there profiling themselves, that if there is some kind of a crisis, that the Democrats aren't going to be ready for it because they, for whatever reason. I mean, I'm not that close, I don't know. But so there are a lot of things that I worry about. But I mean, but my basic answer is always the same, that if we are active, that's going to be the best thing for the transition as well as for getting to the transition.
Professor, thank you very much for coming tonight. I enjoyed what you had to say. Looking back, in 1969, I led a very small special forces team into Cambodia. We ended up 38 miles outside of Angkor Wat. This was in 1969. And we happened to be the first unit to find the first killing fields. We had estimated that the killing field that was there, and it was their practice field, was about 10,000 people were murdered. And we went back to our units to report it, and we were told never to discuss this because we were illegally in Cambodia. And what happened in Cambodia was interesting because it was a soft tyranny at first, that the Khmer Rouge were coming, they were the heroes. They came in on white horses, and they were going to free the people and everything, when people were, open arms for this kind of a mindset. And it ended up to be a soft tyranny at first, and it turned into a Holocaust. It took about 6 years for that to happen. And I see that happening in this country. A slow, incremental, soft tyranny starting to turn into a harder tyranny, and possibly turning into something. We have right now a regular army unit right up here on Route 1, which is regular army. It's not National Guard. For all of you who don't know, during the Bush years, George Bush deactivated the National Guard in a way that rendered them almost useless to defend us against anything that would be major. He took away all crew-served weapons from the National Guard and gave them to the regular army. So the National Guard only has shoulder-fired weapons and light machine guns, okay? And yes, and the question is, okay, with this, I hear you talking, and if my memory serves me correct, I took an oath when I was in the Army to serve the Republic, not a democracy. And why is it the academic class uses democracy when we in fact are a constitutional republic?
Oh, okay. So that's an easy one. The book is about the Republic. I actually use the words Republic in the book all the time, and in the talk as well. You might have noticed I was talking about the Republic. The Republic is our constitutional order. Our constitutional order is a republic as opposed to a monarchy in the relevant contrast of the late 18th century. And I think Republic, I agree with you. I think that we should talk about this more, but I agree with you. I think that republic is the more important word, because republic means the public matter. It means that the government, however we handle successions of power, which is what democracy is about, the government is fundamentally of the people, by the people, for the people. That's what republic means. The res publica, like the public matter, the public thing. That comes first, and that's why I talk about the republic actually all the time. So, what your criticism of the academic class, I think would be actually better formulated more broadly. We talk about democracy too much. We turn into a kind of cliche that whatever is in America is democracy and whatever is democratic is American. And then we don't notice that the very things which have made us much less democratic than other countries, we also don't notice how little democratic a lot of our history has actually been. And we don't notice the fundamental distinction I think you're trying to make, which is that democracy is a way of keeping the republic going. It's many other things. It's an opportunity to be a citizen. It's an opportunity to be equal with one's fellow citizens. But democracy is a way to keep a republic going. Kings live, they die, you have successors. Republics need some other succession principle. Our succession principle is democracy. I happen to think it's a good one. But I agree with you that we are fundamentally a constitutional rule of law state that takes the form of a republic. And fundamentally, that's the thing that has to be preserved. And with the business about loyalty and law, right? That's about republics, all the way back to Rome. The moment when loyalty trumps law is the moment when a republic dies.
It sounded like you were from the Midwest originally. Is that you were?
What do you mean it sounded like?
Well, you said Ohio. I want to make sure I didn't misunderstand.
I can code switch on you, but
Yeah.
I don't think you want that.
Well, I can code switch too. I'm from Southern Indiana. I went home for a class reunion beginning of October, and I sort of unfollowed a couple of people on Facebook so that we would still be able to talk to each other. And I didn't block them, I just unfollowed them and told them I unfollowed you so we can have conversation, and we did. And I have been shocked. First thing was the day of the election, because I almost wore a white dress to the polling place. And I was really glad I just wore the white scarf. And I was numb, the day after. And then I saw a high school English teacher of mine who I respect beyond, post the next day. Very unusual for him to post anything online on Facebook. And he said, today is a victory for those of us in the Midwest and the areas where we have been forgotten against the East Coast elites. Now this put me into a tailspin because I spent 25 years in the Midwest and all of a sudden I'm an East Coast elite because I've been another 25 plus years here. And the thing that shocked me the most was all these people that were talking Christian right values for all these years. And when I look at them and said 5 weeks before the election, look, just for the record, that there's no Christian values here. They had this deer in the headlights look, like I don't know what to say back, but they damned if they weren't going to vote for it. And I want to know, what do you think happened to all this Christian right values thing that seemed to be driving the right for such a long time?
So I'm going to say some stuff that we both know that maybe not everybody else knows that we probably agree about, and then I'm going to try to answer your question. The first thing is that a state like Ohio, Indiana less so, although it's more true than people would think, a state like Ohio is divided pretty much down the middle, right? So Obama carried Ohio the last 2 elections, and part of the mystery, or a different mystery, or related mystery, is why so many people who voted for Obama twice voted for Trump in 2016. But it's important for us, on the East Coast, whether we're from here or not, to remember a lot of these places are divided right down the middle, and it's not okay to talk about flyover country, right? It's just like that reflex that people here do have of just saying like, it's just like one big red ravine out there, and you just fall into it, and eventually you're in the grip of Satan. That reflex does have political consequences, and I'm going to start picking on the Midwesterners in a second, but it does matter that one of our reactions out here to the election was to say, not yours and mine, but I think, I do hear my New York friends saying flyover country without quotation marks, right? That reflex does hurt, and that does make a difference. Second thing, the business of the Midwest, or the Midwest plus the Great Plains, I would say, being ignored by the East Coast is true. I mean, it's true in a very specific sense, which is that our local media have died. And our local media, so the local media were they were the barrier to fake news. Without local news, you get the fake news. Because when people don't have local newspapers that they read and they trust, then they're vulnerable to the stuff that they don't know personally, right? Which is like the stuff that appears on Fox News, or for that matter, CNN. You don't know it personally. Like it's far away from you. It's in New York, it's in DC, it's in Syria, but you get used to whatever narrative pattern is in it. And if you don't have local news, then the fake news creeps in. So we should have bailed out the local newspapers in 2008. It would have cost 0.000, I did the math once, 0.001% or 0.0001% of the bank bailout. And if we bailed out the local newspapers in 2008, if we'd given like all of them like a 10-year chance to adapt to the new world, if we still had local newspapers, I honestly think none of this would have happened. So it's not that the East Coast has maliciously ignored the Midwest, but it is true that the only investigative reporting that happens in the country anymore is happening in Washington D.C. and New York, right? And so like if you want to read an investigative story about opioids, it's very often some guy who's he's parachuted in from Washington, and God bless him that he did it, right? But it really should be the Cleveland Plain-Dealer and the Columbus Dispatch and the Dayton Daily News and the Cincinnati Enquirer who have the staff and the money to do those stories, right? I mean, not that they don't write about these things, but they just don't have the money. They don't have the base to do it right, and that has hurt us as a country. It's hurt us a lot. And so when people say that, I think there is a side of it that is true. I think that the absence of local information paved the way for these various kinds of crazy conspiracies. On the Christian right, I mean, I think a lot of things were happening here. One was that Hillary Clinton was portrayed, going back to the internet question, in a way which did make her seem worse than pretty much everything. There are just a lot of people out there who actually think she's a murderer, right? And that's one of the 10 Commandments. I mean, they really do believe that she is, in a literal sense, a murderer, and that's one of the 10 Commandments too. And then, of course, there's the style of the Christianity rather than the substance, which is a point which is relevant to say like Hungary or other places like Russia, where they style themselves, to be Christian, but there's not actually any Christianity in the sense of the substance of it involved. A lot of it is the kind of it's authoritarian. Christianity is kind of what somebody else says it is, and Mr. Trump benefited from that. The fact, because he's obviously, I mean, he is one of the least. I mean, I don't, I'm not like I read the Gospels, but like I haven't done it since the day before yesterday. But in my opinion, Mr. Trump is one of the least Christian people that you could encounter in pretty much every way. Thought, practice, whatever, he's just about the least Christian thing going, right? I mean, I don't say that I can smell the sulfur from here, but I can smell the sulfur from here, right? But I think it has something to do with the authoritarian structure of local evangelical churches, because you're not talking about big denominations anymore. You're very often taught. I mean, most Protestants in this country don't belong to mainline denominations anymore. They belong to small and in many ways charming and locally effective and often very loving and charitable and generous on a certain scale organizations, but which are organized around a simple hierarchy with one person at the top. And I think that kind of thing makes you used to the notion that that there's a leader. And I think, like many organizations, they have the vices of their virtues and the virtues of their vices. I think that's part of what's going on. And then, one more thing about Mr. Trump and all of this is that he went there, I don't remember if he went to Indiana, probably did, but you know, he went to Wilmington, Ohio. He went to northeastern Ohio. He said things that made absolutely no sense and which were self-serving, and which were, you know, frankly, just completely, you know, despicable lies. But he did go, and he did talk about the economy, you know, and that made a difference. Anyway, I don't really buy into, I think a lot of it's informational, going back to but I don't buy into this idea that like we can't get across this. There is a Midwest here and there's an East Coast here, but there are also all kinds of transmission belts, and I think they're very important right now. You know, and one of the things, like I go to the Midwest to get beat up on a regular basis, and I mean not literally beat up. It hasn't come to that, but it's important, you know, and like I find it useful. And here's another thing. Like, okay, I'll do one last pick on East Coasters. Some of the stuff in the narrative is true, like going back to the inequality. Like the conclusions drawn from the inequality might be wrong. Like the idea that you should vote for a narcissistic kleptocrat who's going to cut taxes for the rich and take your Medicaid away, that's not the right thing to do about inequality. But the story about the inequality is true. And Hillary Clinton's idea that like on average we're all doing better, that's not false, but it's kind of not relevant, right? It wasn't relevant to a lot of people. So anyway, that's the best I can do. Thank you.